Hello and welcome to Advice in Action, the conference event from the Advice in Southampton Partnership. Today we're going to be looking at domestic violence and abuse and the advice and support that's available for victims. Our speakers today are Vicky McCarthy, Domestic Abuse Team Leader at Yellow Door, Gabby and Martha, both from Citizens Advice Southampton, and Jason Murphy, Stronger Communities Manager at Southampton City Council. We'll be covering the different types of abuse and the signs of abuse so that you can spot those in your service users, and you'll also learn what you should do if you think someone is being abused. We'll look at the related issues that victims so often face, for example, housing problems, benefits, debt and money worries, and immigration. And you'll get a really good overview of the support that's available locally. Finally, Jason will talk about the new Domestic Violence Act and what it means for our services. I'm now going to hand you over to Vicky from Yellow Door.
Hi everybody, I'm Victoria McCarthy and I'm the Domestic Abuse Team Leader at Yellow Door in Southampton. So Yellow Door is a domestic and sexual abuse charity. We started in 1985 and we were formerly known as Southampton Rape Crisis. Over the years, we've expanded our services and projects, and we changed our name to Yellow Door in 2016. So at present, we offer a variety of services, which includes adult therapy. We have a CYP service and also family therapy. And we offer play and talking therapies, as well as art and group programs. We also have our ISVA service for victims of sexual violence and abuse, and ISVA stands for Independent Sexual Violence Advocates. Our domestic abuse team works with children, young people and adults who have experienced domestic abuse and are now living safely. And we focus primarily on recovery and trauma-informed programs, education, advice and support. We have our diversity and inclusion service, and our STAR programme, which offers education and prevention within secondary schools in Southampton. We have got the PIPA helpline, which we run alongside the IDVA service, our Yellow Door helpline, and our new trauma-informed service. So what is domestic abuse? So there are many different factors that come under the domestic abuse umbrella. And the Home Office definition is that it is any incident, or particularly a pattern of incidents, of controlling, coercive or threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over, who have either been intimate partners or are family members, regardless of gender or sexuality. It can encompass, but is not limited to, psychological, physical, sexual, financial and emotional abuse, which we're going to be looking into more detail now, as well as stalking and harassment and honour-based violence. So physical abuse is primarily kind of what we see most of represented in the media, but it is not limited to sort of visible injury and punching and slapping and kicking, although absolutely does include those things. It also includes pushing, shoving, strangulation and choking, smothering and drowning, which are the real sort of high risk incidents of physical abuse, as well as hitting with an object or throwing objects at somebody. But when we're thinking outside of the box as well, there are other things. So particularly for perpetrators of abuse where there are caring responsibilities, you might be seeing things such as withholding healthcare, withholding medication, or overdoing medication, limiting access to food, nutrition, water, limiting access to kind of outside, fresh air, exercise, creating a dependency on substances, so drugs and alcohol. So there are lots of different things that physical abuse can include. Emotional abuse tends to be where domestic abuse starts. So it's kind of like the dripping tap effect. What usually happens is that it starts with emotional abuse and then there is the escalation throughout that relationship. it's used as a tactic to create a dependency from the victim to the perpetrator, because it belittles and impacts negatively upon the victim's self-esteem and their confidence. And this is created through constant belittling, shaming, and humiliation, name-calling, making negative comparisons, making threats to victim, to their children, or to themselves, blackmailing, threatening to commit suicide, and again, blaming the victim for that, and blaming for the abuse. So it creates a feeling of ultimate responsibility from the victim as to why abuse is happening to them, and also shame and guilt. So psychological abuse. So despite the overlap, psychological abuse is widely accepted to be sort of more insidiously harmful and mentally undermining than emotional abuse, because its intention is to make the survivor question their own sanity, their own judgment, their memories, and their mental health. Particularly for victims where there are already mental health issues which are exacerbated by the abuse, or that are becoming mentally unwell because of the abuse they're experiencing. This is also one area of abuse that has hardly any legal protections, as most of the behaviours they're not necessarily criminal. So gaslighting, we see a lot more represented in the media now. So manipulating someone into doubting their own sanity, making them feel like they're losing their mind, that things that are happening are not actually happening to them. So making someone think they're crazy, using intimidation, withholding affection, love, support, ignoring somebody, isolating them from support networks or the outside world, and convincing them that they are to blame. So there are the overlaps there with the emotional abuse, as you can see. So sexual abuse, so any sexual act whereby there is not the consent of the other person. So the main kind of thing that you would see under the sexual abuse umbrella would be rape. There's also unwanted touching or demanding sex from another person, or demanding any sexual act from another person, name calling, forcing the other person to engage in prostitution or pornography, forcing them to have sex with others beside their partner, insisting on anything sexual that frightens or hurts the other person, refusing to use safe sex practices, preventing from using birth control, or controlling decisions about pregnancy and or abortion. There's also revenge porn as well now. So threatening to send or publish intimate pictures of another person or videos of another person. And with consent, it's about understanding that it can be withdrawn at any time, and that somebody must have capacity in order to make an informed decision and give an informed yes to the sexual act that they are taking part in. So there should be no guilt around that decision. They should not be under the influence of drugs or alcohol or substances that impair their ability to do this. They should not have a disability, physically or mentally, that's going to impact on their capacity to consent, and they should be aged 16 years and above. So financial abuse, it's not always widely recognised, but it is a huge barrier for victims of domestic abuse when it comes to leaving a relationship. It's a way of controlling and gaining power over a victim. And it takes the form of many things. So not allowing somebody to access money, preventing them from getting a job, or forcing them into work whilst the abusive person does not work, and then they claim all that money for themselves, having to account for every penny that's spent, having to ask others for money, the perpetrator racking up lots of debts in the victim's name, taking the victim's money and spending it on their own choosing, or spending it inappropriately. So it could be for drug and alcohol habits, gambling, not letting them have any information or make any decisions about finances, committing financial fraud, maybe not allowing the victim to have a bank account, putting all assets in the perpetrator's name, putting all benefit payments in the perpetrator's name. So potentially the person that is experiencing this may not have any access to funds at all. So then when we're looking at supporting somebody to leave, that has so many implications to it. So coercion and control. So this was a new offence. It was created in December 2015. It is a bit problematic in terms of legislation, as some would argue it does not go far enough. It's very, very difficult to prove. But it was created as a result of acknowledging that all of the categories of domestic abuse, coercive and controlling behaviour is the most high risk and the most common form of abuse found when we're looking at the history of domestic homicide reviews. So as you can see here, it is an act or pattern of acts which can include isolation, depriving of basic needs, monitoring time, monitoring online communication using tools or spyware, similarly to that, stalking and harassment, taking absolute control over aspects of the victim's everyday life, such as where they go, who they see, what they wear, where they sleep, depriving access to support services, and controlling finances, just to name a few. So it really does encompass kind of all of the other things that we've spoken about today. So stalking and harassment, again, is seen as one of the most high risk factors when we're looking at domestic abuse cases, particularly when we look at homicide reviews as well. This was an offence created in 2012. It's particularly seen when an abusive relationship ends, and it's used as a means of perpetrators to maintain that control. So once their control and their power is challenged, that's when it becomes most dangerous for our victims of domestic abuse. Very high risk behaviours. Like I said, there's a clear link between homicides of women and the experience of stalking. The public probably mostly familiar with stalking when we're looking at a celebrity context, but actually it is huge when we're looking at a domestic abuse context. So I won't go through all of these here, but they are there for you to see. So lastly, honour-based violence. So again, something that we see within the Southampton community, it's domestic abuse perpetrated with the motivation to restore honour to a family or a community. So when there's been a challenge or shame brought upon a family, it can be very, very risky for the victims within that community. It can be any type of the behaviours or categories that we've previously discussed today. And it's often perpetrated by more than one person, for example, multiple family members or members of that particular community. It's found wherever there are a particularly patriarchal structure within a community, and male and female victims can both be perpetrators or victims. There's estimated 12 honour killings a year in the UK. Worldwide, 5,000, although that's a bit of a rough estimate. And the behaviours that could bring shame on a family or community can be that the way that somebody's dressing, it being seen as too Western, or not obeying elders within the community, or rejecting their religious or cultural practices, refusing arranged marriage, disapproval of partners, seeking a divorce, or homosexuality. Again, it's a huge risk factor when we're looking at domestic abuse, and it would be something that would potentially see a lot of with our IDVA service as well, and also with our diversity and inclusion service here. That kind of brings us on now to recognising domestic abuse. And this slide kind of just encompasses the more obvious things that we would be looking at. For instance, things like injuries, they could be visible or hidden. They might be hidden under clothing. Abusive people may purposely injure victims in places that can't be seen by members of the public or support networks. So it's not always clear that it's going on, but they could also be visible too. And it can be things like bruising, scratches, bite marks, burns, missing hair, that type of thing, in line with the physical abuse. Changes in behaviour. So victims may become quieter than usual. They may seem more anxious, more on edge, more in that kind of survival mode. They may be quite tearful. They may seem less energised, less upbeat, less able to take on normal day-to-day tasks or work activities. There may be changes in their appearance. So they may be dressing differently, maybe more covered up perhaps. somebody that may have taken more pride in their appearance before, potentially not so much anymore, because it may be that their clothing is being monitored and controlled. They may lose weight, they may seem more tired, they may gain weight, sort of any kind of obvious changes in appearance. Withdrawal or isolation, so becoming withdrawn from friends, family, colleagues, maybe not turning up to work, maybe being late to work, maybe not responding on the telephone or to emails as they once would, not attending social gatherings or events, or when they do, they're seeming on edge, having to be back by a certain time, checking their phone a lot, could be receiving lots of texts and calls and being very guarded about their phone, seeming quite embarrassed, having to answer things all the time, or seeming very nervous when they're unable to answer or they've missed a call or a text message. Having lots of rules that they need to follow and lots of things that they need to do to please the abuser or the perpetrator, and having a lack of access to money, so not seeming to ever kind of have any control over their finances or anything to kind of get them by day to day, or keeping receipts and being nervous about spending money and always having to account for each penny. So what to do then if you think someone is being abused? So really, really importantly is to listen to what that person is saying. You may be the first person that they disclose their experiences to. So it's so important that they feel heard and they feel acknowledged and believed in what they're saying. We have a lot of service user feedback, which is exactly that. It's the first time I felt heard, the first time I felt believed, and that was the most important thing to me. It's for them to feel supported and also know that there is support out there for them to access if and when they are ready to do so. So it's really important that you're ready to be able to provide information about local services, about what they can do from this point on, if they want to. And again, it is about recognizing that cycle of change and making sure that we are not taking someone's choice away from them or them feeling forced into making a decision that they don't want to or not ready to do so yet. What we want is for this person to continue talking and to stay engaged and not to feel frightened or worried and to kind of back away from support. To discuss safety, so asking the question, how are you feeling in terms of your safety? Is there anything that we can do to help you feel safer? Did you want to report this? What support networks do you have in place? They may feel that they want to report, in which case they may need some support in doing that. But also it is about reaching out to local agencies and services to make sure that we're giving the right safety information and we're signposting accordingly for that. I've spoken about allowing victims to make their own decisions and empowering them to do that. So walking alongside them rather than kind of taking them out of their hands and doing it for them. Not telling somebody to leave. Okay, so allowing them to make that judgment themselves. And being very honest about what our role is, what our information sharing policies are, what our safeguarding policies are, and making sure that we are transparent and we are clear so that the service user does not feel deceived by our role. So making sure that we are working with them and following the policies that we have in place to keep our victims safe and also to keep ourselves safe, and ultimately to be looking after ourselves and recognising our triggers and the way that this can impact upon us as well, depending on our own experiences. So self-care is really important in that, and making sure that we are working with our service managers and colleagues as well. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my part of today. So thank you very, very much for listening. And I will now pass you on to Gabby from Citizens Advice. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Gabby McInnes, and I work as an immigration advisor and a gateway supervisor at Citizens Advice Southampton. So my colleague Marta and I will try to do our best to summarize the most common issues and areas of inquiry we encounter when dealing with victims of domestic violence, and the help they may be able to receive at Citizens Advice. So our team is made of volunteers from different sectors and backgrounds in our community. We also have volunteer family, employment, and housing barristers who are sometimes able to provide one-off advice to our clients. In addition, we have dedicated paid staff working as caseworkers, supervisors, and managers. So the contribution made by everybody makes possible for Citizens Advice Southampton to deliver a wide range of advice and support to our clients, including to those who are victims of abuse, threatening behavior, and violence. People can talk to us face-to-face when necessary, but also they can reach us through the phone, web chat, email, or through our very successful hubs that are available at Central and Shirley libraries. So to communicate with clients who do not speak English, we can also use language line interpreters who are easily available through the telephone. So when we find that a person is or could be a victim of domestic violence, we follow the safeguarding procedures. This may involve referring to organizations that you are likely to be familiar with. However, there are also related areas such as housing, benefit, money and debts, family and immigration law that may need further exploration and advice. Victims require to discuss a variety of issues arising of their change of circumstances. For example, due to their relationship breakdown as a consequence of domestic violence, they are now single parents without income who have become excluded occupiers in their accommodation and without the possibility of paying their overdraft or claiming public funds due to their immigration status. Areas of inquiry do not normally present on their own, but they are linked, and we try to be ready to address them with the information, advice, and casework we can provide. We work in partnership with other organizations such as Macmillan and Meiji Center, while being part of a wider support network where we are happy to signpost or refer when necessary. Housing is a main area of concern for victims of domestic violence. Victims who are not homeless are sometimes left with two questions. Should I stay? Should I go? The answer is not always straightforward or evidence and requires exploration of their circumstances. Are they tenants, owners? Are they married? Unmarried partners? Do they have children? What is their immigration status? We also need to evaluate the risks, vulnerabilities. Can they afford? What do they need? And what are their wishes? So only after listening to them, we can then discuss their tailored short and long-term housing options. For instance, access to refuge, assistance from the council under the homelessness legislation, general information about property or tenancy rights. We can also provide information about occupation orders, registration of interest of a property with the land registry, which is called beneficial interest. Or we can also signpost or refer to the Southampton Rent Deposit Scheme, letting agencies, or housing solicitors. Be aware that may also be alternative even for people without recourse to public funds under the Social Care Act and the local authority additional powers to accommodate, especially during these times of COVID. So be alert as this is worth to explore, especially for vulnerable people and victims of domestic violence are vulnerable. Regarding benefits, those fleeing violence may also need to know whether they are able to access public funds to start to plan their new life. Our team can do benefit checks and look in more detail at their specific eligibility for a benefit. For those who are able to access benefits, it may also mean a change of circumstances, transitions from a legacy benefit into universal credit without the protection that confers a natural transition. We can also help with better off calculations and filling in all types of benefit forms. We have a team that is called the Help to Claim team that takes people through the process of applying for universal credit until their first payment is received. We also have dedicated benefit case workers who can take on cases that require ongoing support or further research, or casework, for instance, the right to reside for people with pre-settled status, or even appeals or mandatory reconsiderations. Another very common area of interest and distress experienced by victims of domestic violence is money. Sometimes in an inquiry about money, we are able to spot signs of financial abuse. Most of the times, there is an economic impact for domestic violence sufferers. There is loss of income, inability to afford essentials, destitution, homelessness, and debts. Moving out of area or becoming a single parent may amount to a change of employment circumstances that will impact their finances. So we will also need to advise on employment rights when this is necessary. We are authorized to provide money advice services, and on this basis, we can advise our clients on budgeting, income maximization, priority and non-priority debts. We have a dedicated debt team that will look at income, expenditure, and surplus to work out our clients' options and provide the support they may need by negotiating with creditors or acting as intermediaries for debt relief orders. Family. This is probably one of the most evident areas of inquiries for victims. They come to us to talk about what's going to happen to their children. How can they access legal aid or a pro bono solicitor if they want to divorce? How can they ask for maintenance for their children? Is anybody available to fill in the court paperwork? We can provide a good deal of initial information and advice in these matters, and then either signpost or refer accordingly to family solicitors if necessary. We do not fill in court paperwork, but we can signpost clients to the support through court organizations that may be able to do it. I will not put you through my colleague Marta, who will be talking about immigration topics that we may encounter.
Hello, my name is Marta, and I work as an immigration advisor for Citizens Advice Southampton, together with Gabi. So another very important aspect to watch out is our clients' immigration status. This is because the immigration status will not only determine the type of support our client has access to, it will also determine whether they are able to remain in the UK after they break up with their abusive partner. If they are British citizens, or if they have a no time limit visa, that it's called settlement, indefinite leave or permanent status, then we don't need to worry about their immigration status after they leave their partners. If they are European nationals or foreign nationals with limited leave to remain granted on their own right, then the same. We don't need to worry about their immigration status. After they leave their partners, they can remain in the UK on their own right. If you are unsure, you can ask your client to show you his or her residence card or virtual status for EA nationals, and then you can see their status. If our client has a limited leave to remain visa, then yes, our client will need immigration advice if such visa was granted or was sponsored by the family member. So if our client requires immigration advice, what can Southampton Citizens Advice do for them? So we would, first of all, we would assess their immigration status, and we will see whether they can remain in the UK safely with their current status, or whether they need to switch to a different immigration status. This is because, for example, a holder of a spouse visa, one of the conditions attached to that visa is that they must be in a genuine and subsisting relationship with their spouse. So this can be a real problem for victims of domestic violence, because if they want to leave their spouse, that means they stop meeting the conditions of their visa. So that's why it's very important we take action and we switch to a different scheme. But often our clients, they might be destitute, so maybe they are not working, they don't have savings, or they don't have access to their accounts, or maybe they already left their partners and are completely destitute. So in those cases, the Home Office has created a really good scheme that provides that is called a destitute domestic violence concession, and provides clients and provides victims of domestic violence a temporary leave to remain with full access to public funds. So often when for social security regulations, people who wish to access public funds, often they need to meet the habitual residence test. But individuals who are granted the destitute domestic violence concession, they are meant to, or they are treated as meeting the habitual residence test. So that is wonderful news for holders of a spouse visa, because they have the option to leave their partners and access benefits. With that visa, they have temporary leave of 3 months, and that is time for them to prepare for their big main application, the settlement application on the basis of domestic violence. So the settlement application is an application they can make in order to obtain indefinite leave, permanent status is all the same, on the basis of their domestic violence. We are able to assist the clients through the legal process and represent those applications. But we are also really busy. So if you wish to refer your client for immigration advice to alternative advisors, you can signpost them to a solicitor with a legal aid contract. Legal aid is not a public fund and is available for the domestic violence route, subject to the means and merits testing. You can find a list of local legal aid solicitors by visiting that website and writing your postcode. Alternatively, you can call a charity called Rights of Women. They provide telephone advice, and on that website, you can see their contact details and the various ways to approach them. And you can also contact Citizens Advice, and my work colleague, Sarah, will pass you details on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Vicky, Marta and Gabby for that. I'm now going to hand over to Jason Murphy from Southampton City Council, who'll be talking about the new. Thank you very much to Vicky, Marta and Gabby for that. I'm now going to hand over to Jason Murphy from Southampton City Council, who'll be talking about the new Domestic Violence Act.
Thank you. So I'm Jason Murphy, Stronger Communities Manager at Southampton City Council. I lead on a range of community safety strategic priorities, one of which is domestic abuse. So within this presentation, I'm going to update you on the Domestic Abuse Act, specifically Part 4, which is now law. So the background to this is that the Act places a duty on Southampton City Council to appoint a Domestic Abuse Local Partnership Board. And we've done that, and that went through Cabinet on the 16th of August, and the first meeting will be on the 5th of October. We have to carry out a safe accommodation needs assessment. So this is an internal and external review. So a lot of partner agencies who will be listening into this presentation will have been part of that. And that in turn helps us inform and develop and publish a safe accommodation strategy, which we need to submit with the Ministry of Housing and Local Communities and Government, the MHCLG, by the 31st of October. So that's a draft that we will be going to consultation on. I should say that the 31st of October has changed to the 1st of January. The government have recognised that there are some local constitutional issues we need to work through. So in order to consult, so please do look out for this in the next few weeks, that will land with the government on the 1st of January. And that has regard to the needs assessment. So everything that internal and external agencies have helped us consider in terms of our local domestic abuse system, some of which you've just heard about, will be reflected in that. So we need to give effect to that strategy. So part of that is about how we commission particularly safe accommodation. The definitions of what is meant by safe accommodation are a bit fluid, so that's not necessarily fixed. But nevertheless, the government has its own view about what is safe, and locally we will have our view about what's sufficient. So as well as the commissioning of services, which I'll talk about in a moment, we would need to look at that in ongoing years. And it also requires that we monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of the strategy and then report back to central government on an annual basis. So these are all new duties that local government has never had before. Some local government councils, could be county level, could be unitary, could be district level, will have varying degrees of strategic work going on, but for the first time, those relationships and those arrangements are formalised in law. So there are some things to note. So I mentioned commissioning. So the current commission services will be out for retender. So that's the process that's starting. And those agencies that are interested in providing contracts for us will be looking at that and will be thinking about how they do that. And that will be inclusive accommodation. And that's for services for delivery from April 2022. We avoid referencing local agencies in that context because obviously some will be interested in that process, and some potentially may not be currently commissioned and will be interested in that process. We aim to incorporate the Part 4 strategy as a chapter in a refreshed domestic and sexual abuse strategy. So we currently have a strategy that is now out of date, and unfortunately COVID has knocked things a little askew. But we're trying to avoid having two sets of documents, two sets of consultations. Unfortunately, we will have to consult on the wider strategy, but the wider strategy will need to consider the continuum of violence against women and girls and all forms of violence within that context, that continuum, everything from low-level harassment through to sexual assaults that occur in the nighttime economy, as well as domestic abuse. So there's a much broader set of priorities that the wider strategy will consider, but the Part 4 strategy reflects all of that good work that's gone on to understand our local need. A big change in the Act is that children will be for the first time defined in their own right as victims. So that has implications in terms of assessment and intervention services and how we support that. But we will await guidance as that inevitably develops within government through Ofsted inspections and just through common sense, really. So there are some gaps and challenges that this needs assessment tell us about. So in Southampton, we have quite a high number of therapeutic interventions offered. They are of good quality, but it can sometimes result in a lack of clarity for who provides what and in relation to what. So, you know, if you take a child protection planning experience as an example, there is often an easy default to therapy, but there are a whole load of other issues within that domestic abuse experience that are not being addressed. So we just need to look at that in the round and make sure that what we commission and what we deliver is good for what we need. There is also a lack of clarity over provision to victims at standard and medium risk. So a lot of high risk activity, and by high risk we usually mean a woman, and we usually do mean a woman, is at risk of serious harm or injury or fatality. But at the standard and medium risk level, there's a lack of clarity in terms of our pathways, the support that we can access as a consequence of referrals through those pathways. And that poses a number of questions that we just need to work through. Are services holding risk that escalates to high? Therefore, is that service response effective? Are those services holding a lot of risk that doesn't escalate to high? Therefore, we've got a lot more domestic abuse in the city than we can contemplate. So we've got to work that through together. And the best way of achieving that is through good data. There's a need to understand the extent of provision in schools and what this covers. So that does extend to all forms of violence against women and girls, the basic educational need in terms of making sure that in this context, boys don't fall into the trap of seeing violence and harassment and assault as acceptable. Gender stereotyping within that, inequality. So all of those issues that inevitably are causation of domestic abuse It would be easy for me to say, but I will say, those of us who fit the stereotype of the white patriarchy, what responsibility do we have to kind of look at that and think seriously about what we're reinforcing? How does gender inequality really play out in how domestic abuse becomes acceptable in some communities, some families, individuals? So this inevitably means we need to focus on perpetrators much more. Cause of violence is perpetrators. Victims are not the cause of their own domestic abuse. So there is a sense that in Southampton, we are not sufficiently focused on perpetrators. There's too much emphasis on victims, too much emphasis on victim blaming, too much emphasis on the victims finding solutions for the violence that they experience. It's the perpetrator that is the cause of that violence, and that's the shift that we want to encourage in terms of all our work. Somehow professionals are not always clear on what's provided within the commissioned offer, so we need to work on that. They do refer for therapeutic services, so this comes back to there are comfort zones with what we know and what we deliver, and that's not necessarily problematic in and of itself, but in terms of our domestic abuse system, we do need to address those other issues that, as I mentioned, perpetrators, the therapeutic services for children is fine, but actually we need to address the causation that leads to the need for therapy. We can be offering therapy, but not necessarily addressing the underlying experience of violence, which means that therapeutic experience is not as impactful as we'd like it to be. And there is a need for health provision services to be aware of the provision, and a particular sense that there is a need for outreach and advocacy, but in a non-high risk context. So the independent domestic violence advocates that sit within my area provide that advocacy for high risk cases, but what level of advocacy do we have for standard and medium risk? That isn't to say it's not provided, it's just there's not clarity about that. So referrals and contacts are PIPA. So PIPA is our front door for victims of domestic abuse and professionals to refer, mostly standard and medium risk. But referrals to that are quite low from adult safeguarding, from children's services, but very high for the police. And this has the effect of overwhelming that service response, in which there's a lot of our chasing our own tail. So we're spending a lot of time understanding what the request is for, only to then establish that an individual didn't consent for support. They were actually high risk, not medium risk. They're already open to an intervention, so the referral wasn't necessary. So there's a lot of complexity within that we need to understand. It's the difference between a police officer giving a victim a card to say, here's a number you can call if you would like help, to completing a complex referral that then overwhelms services through a triage process that isn't effective because we're not delivering the interventions that we might like to provide in a timely way. So in terms of our commissioning, there has been an absence of a strategic partnership. So hopefully the new Domestic Abuse Board will overcome that to some extent. There is obviously the Joint Commissioning Board. So in terms of the commissioning framework, that's not problematic. But in terms of the domestic abuse context, there hasn't always been that focus. So the need to link that to a strategic group. And one of the questions about the existing strategy group, which we've now stood down, should I say, that the new board will pick up, has been that it hasn't really been looking at those questions around what's the data telling us, what's effective, what works, what do we therefore need to commission, when we commission, what's the review of their performance, and what's that performance telling us in that complete cycle of what we need to do next or what we need to do more of. We also have some questions around the role of the Office and Police and Crime Commission. Positive questions. So they currently commission our independent sexual violence advocacy, and some of that resource sits within Yellow Door, for example. Very welcome. But they're also looking at having a more sustainable commissioning cycle. So over a 3-year county-wide basis, we're interested in working with the OPCC to make sure that we can get economies of scale, that where we can share learning and practice, we do that, where we can chase the money together, that we do that. And where we can create Hampshire-wide systems of support, that we also do that. So Southampton has had a bit of a history of wanting to avoid the Hampshire-level conversation, a bit of an independent Republic of Southampton. We're now much more open to collaboration, both at a local level but at a sub-regional level, so that we can get the best bang for our buck, and the social value is achieved through, commissioning services together rather than in isolation. I mentioned Yellow Door there. That's just an example of an existing commission service. It might mean that in that wider framework, other partners come in that's not a comment on Yellow Door's capacity to deliver those services at all, but it's just an example of, in our local ecology of services that we rely on, within that there are some risks. So we will want to make sure that that those experts in our local area are well prepared for that process and succeed. So perpetrators, the Hampton Trust, currently commissioned by Hampshire County Council and Southampton City Council, they deliver a range of interventions with identified perpetrators of domestic abuse, as well as support to their partners or ex-partners. Best practice is that professionals refer to Hampton Trust, although individual perpetrators can refer themselves. And then they continue to work with that individual following a referral whilst attendant on that programme. So that's almost obvious in a sense, but it enables ongoing monitoring support in a multi-agency context. However, referrals have been quite low from some agencies. And one of the narratives that is around is that the door is closed when that's not necessarily the case. That programs don't exist when that's not necessarily the case. So we have to work hard to make sure that with churn in professional organisations, and often it is because of churn, people come and go, they move into different roles, they leave the organisation, whatever it is. We have to constantly keep making sure that people have awareness of the current referral pathways, and that they use them to full effect. And this comes back to perpetrator focus. If we have the resource, to not be using the resource is potentially undermining our local effort. So some services close cases as soon as a referral is made. So this is a problematic feature of our local system. What this means is rather than holding on to the risk, which in a multi-agency context should be managed, the outcome is we've referred this to a commission service, we've referred this to Hampton Trust, the IDVAs are involved, and then those agencies step back, and that creates a whole additional layer of risk, because those agencies inevitably, when things go wrong, can only go back to where we started. But actually, other than in the safeguarding context, the trigger for that multi-agency process to start again would be an offence. It would be violence against usually a woman. So we got to look at that, because that's a cultural issue in city of a handoff culture, the sharing of intelligence is a feature of that, needing to make sure that we don't drop the ball. A classic example would be a perpetrator moving from one family to another family, but those families being worked in silos, joining up the intelligence that tells us that this perpetrator is a risk, and that's recognised on day one of an intervention, because they don't always present as perpetrator, and the potential victim doesn't always know that they're a perpetrator. There are a number of risks within that simply because of this closure. We think that a community perpetrator programme is considered to be an essential part of our local response. So we need to think about that in terms of what models of delivery there are or there can be. But within that, this term community means that all agencies take responsibility. So we all take responsibility for the work that we do with perpetrators, and work alongside them, because it's not about wagging a finger at them. It is about saying, we know that you want to be a good parent. How can we help you? But the perpetrator is often absent from the discussion. I can't think of any other criminal context where the perpetrator would be absent from the discussion. So I think there is something to be understood here. If we bring it back to my comment about patriarchy, have we got into the habit of viewing domestic abuse as somehow different in a criminal context? Of course it is, but at the base level, there is a criminal offence. And we wouldn't not be working with the perpetrator in any other perpetrator context. Too much focus is on the victim to bring about safety for themselves. So we need to shift expectations away from victims, and we need to reassert that they are responsible for the violence, and they are the cause for the negative outcomes for the family. So part of this is about bringing in training that will help practitioners recognise that the mental health crises, the drug and alcohol abuse, the neglect of children, they are all consequences of the violence that a victim, including the children, are experiencing. So safety can only be achieved by addressing the violence. Too much focus is on the mental health, the drug and alcohol abuse, the child neglect, all of which are valued and need to be addressed, but to the exclusion of the perpetrator. So we are at risk of never actually understanding what the solution to the problem is, and it just creates more demand at our front doors that's not manageable. these are simplistic statements I'm giving, so that they are open to challenge, of course. So gaps in our knowledge. One of the particular features of this is perpetrators are fathers. So not all domestic abuse occurs in a context where there are children, but where it does, there is a particular need to really hone in on that. And this comes back to my point of working with perpetrators as fathers in a restorative way. It's not about finger wagging. It's not about blame, but it is about challenge in a constructive and appropriate way, and helping them to be the best parent that they can be. Too much of what victims are experiencing, too much of the coercive control is through the family courts, is through the issues of contact with children. The children's become weaponized and traumatized as a result of the control that perpetrators can have through the family court system or through the contact system. So, we need to kind of find ways to mitigate that. We need to clarify the role of probation. And again, what's the multi-agency discussion that goes on if perpetrators are open and supported by probation? How do we make sure probation are played into that work? How do we make sure that information is flowing in both directions? And clarify that in the context of police high harm response, police high harm team, the work of the Hampton Trust, and then those integrated offender management functions, MAPA functions, where we've got high risk planning, but we're not necessarily joining the dots in terms of impact on victims and children. And inevitably that means reviewing information sharing agreements to support that work. I'm just going to comment on sexual violence. So sexual violence has always been a priority feature of the previous domestic and sexual abuse strategic group, but it was sexual violence that never got talked about. It got lost in all of the conversations about domestic abuse. The new board, the new domestic abuse board, will be looking at that, as will the Safe City Partnership. So we've landed that point that we need a strategic space to think about this. And we're talking about a continuum of violence. So yes, there will be some pushback where people say, but what about the men and boys? But what the data tells us is the vast majority of perpetrators of violence against women in a continuum of violence experienced by women and girls are men and boys. We're talking about low-level harassment at school. We're talking about remarks that are made on the street, wolf whistling that is directed to women that walk along the street, abuse and harassment, stalking that occurs online and in the real world, assaults that take place in the nighttime economy, rape. So we're talking about that whole continuum. So it is really important that as a city that we look at this, and there's some data that I'll just reference in a minute. It's not going to be the Broad's primary focus. There are spaces where we talk about these things, but we really want to prioritise that, and that will be reflected in that wider strategy that we'll be working on. So here's some of the data. So this is some analysis that we undertook, and there's more work to be done here. But there were 1,300. Well, there were more than 1,300 recorded violence against women crimes in 1920 alone. So this was in the run-up to COVID. The COVID year gives us a different set of data because it's inevitably going to be an odd year. But 37% of those offences were linked to only 2 city centre wards. So we do think that is largely about the nighttime economy being in the city, assaults that take place in that context, assaults that take place in our parks. But not exclusively. 47% under 25, so that's a real worry. In terms of those that might be more inclined to gravitate to those places. Inevitably, younger people will want to go to nightclubs and bars in a town centre. But they also happen to be serious violence hotspots. So not just VORG, but knife crime and other violent offences. So some people might say, well, yeah, we would expect those areas to be more problematic. But in another context, you might think with all the security and the police and street pastors and things going on, that there would be less. So we need to look at that. A peak period of reporting, 1,500 hours. So we think that's about schools. We think that's about colleges and finishing times. People are in transit at those times, and this is when a lot's happening that can get out of control. But also they are opportunities for more exploitative individuals to target women and girls. That is a risk. The hospital area is a particular hotspot, and again, we think female staff in transit could be at risk. So we need to look at that. And we need to think about mitigation. Some of it might be, physical changes we can make to the environment, the use of CCTV, etc. It could be about advice that we give, but we probably also need to target some perpetrators and remove them, frankly, from those areas. Southampton, sadly, is second highest for sexual offences in its crime comparators. So, in a group of community safety partnerships, Southampton is the second worst performing and the 10th highest in all of England's community safety partnerships. So, there's something dramatic happening here that we've got to get a grip of. A survey that the OPCC, the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner, undertook highlighted 68% of their respondents had some kind of sexual harassment in recent times. So one of the risks for us that the needs assessment highlights is our data. Our data is not coordinated, it's not seamless. We have no single dashboard. It's really difficult for executive leads to press a button and understand what the issues are. And inevitably no analysis as a consequence. So we need to look at that. We have been given new burdens money through the Domestic Abuse Act, so that will allow us to do a number of things, one of which is to build some data capacity. But we will also be recruiting a domestic abuse coordinator who will have a whole system view of what's going on. So they will work with everybody, internal and external, to create a unifying set of insights to what's going on. Again, to support that commissioning process, to respond to the level of need, to put in appropriate challenge where need be, and to advise executive leads on how we're doing and what we need to do differently. So an expert. I'm not an expert. I should have said that at the start. You probably guessed that as you've listened to me going along, but I can offer strategic oversight, but those roles will really help add value to our local ecology of support. Just the final point is we had to do a mapping exercise of the data that we hold. So that was quite revealing. So it shows that we don't hold much demographic data across our systems. We can't really break things down in terms of age. We can't break things down in terms of proximity. We can't overlay one agency's set of data with another to really get to a single dashboard. So that's something that we will be working on over the coming months and years. Okay, we're almost there, folks. So the role of the new board, just to top and tail this. So the new board will provide that strategic leadership, direction and oversight, as well as a degree of multi-agency coordination. So hopefully for the first time, with an executive lead, which is the director of communities, culture and homes in SEC, with the support of that coordinator, with that new insight that we've been given through standing together support in undertaking that needs assessment, we will get to a place where things will start to improve, or we will at least have greater awareness of what's going wrong. Timescales. So the tender process for commission services is underway, so that will be happening through October to November. And those agencies out there that wish to tender will be making a case for why we should contract with them. That will be evaluated in December, and then the contract's awarded at the beginning of 2022 to start in April. And then the next steps for the board will be first meeting on the 5th of October and a schedule of meetings ongoing into June 2022. The needs assessment will be submitted for the 1st of January, not the 31st of October. We're currently working on the role of the Domestic and Sexual Abuse Operations Group. So many people listening in might be part of that, but that's effectively a doing group. So that's where more detailed discussions happen. But we, again, need to make sure that we don't get lost in a conversation about how busy we all are. We need to get on and do some collaborative work, such as planning campaigns, training, events, reviewing the data, sharing good practice, promoting survivor voice in our work. And making sure that we involve other providers such as housing providers and homelessness charities in that work. And we're recruiting that coordinator. So that role will be out for advert in the next few weeks. And hopefully there'll be a good local candidate with good experience, might be listening into this presentation and will come and work for us in our system. So that's me. Thank you very much.
On behalf of all of our speakers today, Jason, Marta, Gabby and Vicky, thank you ever so much for listening. If you have any questions or comments on this presentation, you can email them to conference@adviceinsouthampton.org.uk or get in touch via our website, adviceinsouthampton.org.uk. Finally, I'll leave you with the contact details of 3 of the essential organisations that we've heard from in this presentation. Thank you.